Here's the video explaining the time zones in Australia and in the whole southern so-called hemisphere. Our flat Earth is hidden within those time zones. I believe the Alaska Purchase is also one of the reasons they used to hide the flat Earth. The whole animosity between the United States and Russia throughout the Cold War, and it's still going on today, it's to hide and close off that particular region so we cannot find out what's really going on. Below the equator we have extremely weird time zones, 30 minutes time zones, 45 minutes time zones. It's the way they found to hide the extensive amount of land below the equator. The globe makes no sense. You have 19 time zones on the top of the globe, followed by 24 time zones between 40th parallel and the equator, and then below the equator you have 32 time zones. In the 1800s, when there was nothing else to discover, the whole Earth had been mapped out, explored. They then created the globe mathematics, and in 1835 they created the Haversine formula. But there was nothing else to discover.
I'd like to be an explorer, like the great Magellan.
Oh, you're too late. There's really nothing left to explore.
This work is the result of research of Hervé Ribony. I decided to make a version in English, add some more slides to illustrate better what he's explaining to us. Hello, my name is Hervé Ribony. I've been a flat earther for 7 years. I want to share with you a few ideas concerning the flat earth, which to my knowledge have not yet been mentioned in any of what I have seen and heard on the matter. The aim of this video is to bring new elements to those seeking the truth and to help in the conception of the flat earth map. I will add that this somewhat technical presentation might not be recommended to those just getting started on this subject. As a professional sailor, I sail in ocean races, and I experience sailing around the world along the 50th latitude south, which goes by the Cape of Good Hope and southern tip of Africa, Cape Lewin in Australia, Cape Horn on the bottom of South America, generally named as the Great Circle by flat earthers. I have also crossed the Atlantic 8 times and traveled more than 100,000 nautical miles. I will use my technical experience to approach this subject in a different way. When I was a skipper acting as captain, I frequently utilized maritime maps, and when I discovered the flat earth, I asked myself how the manipulators went from a flat surface to a sphere without it being obvious that the sphere does not work, when taking into account travel times, distance, and the positions of the continents. What method did the manipulators use to fool the entire world without it being obvious on the maps we use? As flat earthers already know, the northern part of the flat earth is much smaller in areas than the southern part, contrary to the heliocentric sphere, where the two hemispheres are supposedly identical. In order to go from the northern part of a flat earth to the northern part of a ball earth, it is necessary to create extra land surface area and enlarge that part of the world and stretch the countries proportionally to the extra surface area. This transformation is not discrete. You need major changes, something that is visibly illogical in order to achieve this. To start with, we will look at the time zones precisely. The time zones are divided into 24 hours around the Earth, as you can see here on this image. They should spread equally around the globe model, from east to west in a longitudinal direction. Or more precisely, it should be divided into 24 identical time zones, following the position of the Sun in relation to the rotation of the Earth. At the same time, if you observe only the northernmost part, you will note that Alaska and Canada are stretched to the west, and little by little they overstep the time zones on their left. They offset further and further to the point where in Alaska, at the Bering Strait, it is 3 o'clock local time, whilst at the same time and in the same place it's also midnight in Russia, on exactly the same longitude. 3 hours are missing here, from 0 hour or midnight in Russia to 3 in the morning in Alaska. To the west of the Bering Strait, it is the same thing. We see that there are 2 hours of time zones missing, the 18-hour and the 20-hour ones. Therefore, in that northern parts of the globe, there are only 19 time zones out of 24. By stretching Canada, Alaska and Russia over less time zones here and there, it creates space at the Bering Strait as well as the great stretches of sea just under the Bering Strait. This creates the extra space needed by the manipulators for the transformation. If, on the contrary, we keep the same stretch for both continents but apply 24 time zones, we find ourselves with 3 time zones just over Alaska alone. And when following the latitudes from east to west, we would change time zones too quickly over too short a distance, which would not correspond to the distance of the sphere model and would raise concern. If we try to place these territories in a logical manner using the 24 official time zones, the results will be close to this old map of the flat Earth, or this one. Look at how at the angle of the coast of the North American continent and that of Russia are different than on a world map, even on the Gleason's map. The coasts are a lot closer on the old maps. In my opinion, the Gleason's map copied this example of the globe. That is why the Gleason's map is not censored on the internet. This is misleading. You can see the difference when excluding some time zones or when using them all. There is no space left under the strait. For the manipulators, the only solution that is least illogical to go from flat to sphere is through this illustration. The rare official crossing in this area, which were made by windsurfers, were undertaken exactly at the Bering Strait, at the closest point between the two continents, where the distance is only 83 kilometers, which makes no difference between the two types of maps. On the other hand, crossing further south, you have to go all the way to Vladivostok, which is located 3,500 kilometers lower, to find the first airline which goes to Seattle before going to Anchorage, or from Tokyo to Vancouver for the maritime crossings. This leaves a large area here which you can say has no credible measurements to back the exactness of the maps. Without any airline paths or maritime routes directly between the two continents, an area as mysterious and difficult to enter as Antarctica. Combined with the pseudo-Cold War rivalry between the USA and Russia, this discourages the curious and the adventurous from sailing these unwelcoming waters. Altogether, a perfect place to make the maps lie. If we come back to the time zones and look at the countries more to the south, all 24 time zones are present, and each country uses the time or that time zone which corresponds to its position. Even further south from the 40th degree north latitude, we see that the time zones are further increased by half-hour increments, and there are 2 extra time zones in the South Pacific to the east of New Zealand. There are officially only 19 time zones in the very northernmost parts of the globe, and at least 32 in the south of the globe. We also note that the places where time zones are increased are either far out at sea, like the Pacific Islands, or have a coastline open to the south, like Iran, India, Burma, or Australia. And in these cases, it's impossible to know how the 32 time zones would be overlaid onto a sphere, since there are areas that are not habitated to the south of these territories. The 32 time zones disappear at sea, which is pretty convenient for the manipulators to hide the anomaly. We also see that USA and Australia have almost the same width on the globe, 4,000 kilometers for Australia and 4,500 kilometers for the USA. This works on the globe. They also have an equivalent latitudinal position, though the USA is a little farther north than Australia in the south. Their positions in latitude are similar enough to be able to compare the time zones for each country according to their width. If we superimpose their position and width on the globe, we see that the width of the time zones between the north and south relative to their latitudinal position are not enough to justify a difference of double the number of time zones. In fact, we can see that there are 4 time zones over the USA and only 2 used in Australia, both countries having the same width. In the middle of Australia, they have added an extra half-hour time zone to make us believe in a third time zone, and in this incorrect projection, Australia overlaps the 22-hour time zone. Australians actually only use 2 time zones, which are shown here. On the time zone chart, Australia appears a lot skinnier than the USA, even after stretching it over the 22-hour time zone. In my opinion, it's not real because this time zone is ignored. The difference in width comes from the time zones being parallel in this representation. On the flat Earth, they get wider to the south, which correlates with the entire width of Australia, only using 2 time zones instead of 4 time zones for the USA. If we place the USA and Australia on the time zones on the flat Earth, the time zones used by both countries makes more sense. Since the time zones don't widen as you go south, it is imperative to stretch the land masses in the north so as to keep the time zones parallel in order to maintain the illusion of a ball with 2 symmetrical hemispheres. We see that this makes no sense on a sphere with 2 symmetrical hemispheres. While it is much more coherent on a flat Earth with the north being smaller than the southern parts of the land, on a simplified flat Earth diagram, the modified time zones would look like this. We can see that the further we get from the center, the more time zones were added by the manipulators in order to hide the larger surface dimensions of the southern time zones comparatively to the north. To finish the circling of the Earth, we see that as you go east, the countries undergo less stretching from north to south in order to return to their correct time zones at the 0 Greenwich longitude, with the sun correctly positioned and ready for the following lap. So, is there no difference between the north and the south? Yes, there is one. It is before sunrise and after sunset. In the north, we have much more clarity before the rising of the sun than in the south. And we have much more clarity after the setting of the sun than in the south. This is because in the south the sun recedes a lot faster from the observer. For the observer in the north, the sun has a tighter circle and will stay longer and closer to him. We have long summer evenings in the north, while in the south, obscurity comes rapidly. It is even more obvious when sailing because there are no mountains to hide the sun. So in the northern hemisphere, when you sail close to the summer solstice during summer along the 50th parallel north, we have light a lot longer and we can even see the glow of the sun behind the horizon all night long. This is something I've never seen in the southern hemisphere at the 50th latitude south. The deleting of time zones at the Bering Strait. The big problem that the manipulators had was at the Bering Strait. There were already 3 hours missing in Alaska to complete the first 12 time zones. The manipulators needed a miracle at the Bering Strait. Either they had to stop time for 3 hours or jump forward 21 hours and get back in sync with the correct sunlight time 1 day later. How can it be done? And what is there that makes the Bering Strait so special? Yes, that's right, the date line. Officially on the ball earth, the date line is like this. So we have two time zones that have been added, the 13th and the 14th, which are here. Obviously, to give the illusion of a ball symmetry. After you add the extra 13th and 14th hour time zones, you bring back the date line in continuation with the first parts of the line, except if you look at the flat earth map here, we can see that 13 and 14 can extend all the way to the edge of the flat earth map here. So you can add time zones. And in this case, we can take the number 1 time zone, which should be here just after New Zealand, and move it to after the 2 extra time zones. We can get away with it because no one lives there. It's not habitated, so we can push everything back with no problem and start the time zones again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 up to South America. So of course they only show the 2 extra time zones starting from the equator out because they don't want to add time zones in the north. They want to minimize them in order to maintain the illusion of the sphere. So they start at the equator and stretch it all the way down to the edge of the flat earth map. And then, seeing that we have no habitated lands to the east of New Zealand, they can very well place the very first time zone to the east of the 2 extra time zones. They can also say that the date line is the ideal place to add or delete time zones, because the change of date makes the missing hours or extra hours much less obvious, especially given that the people on either side of the date line are not on the same days, making the comparison much more difficult. Exactly on the date line, they have deleted 2 hours, 2 time zones from Alaska, where it begins at 3 hours, and we have already seen as they have added 2 hours from the equator down, and this is only along the date line itself. But if you take the entire ball earth into the equation, 5 hours have been removed from the very north, and at least 8 were added in the south. So this zone here has nowhere that is habitable, and so there is no physical point of reference to help determine the size the time zone should measure. If, for example, we take the competitors of the Vendée Globe boat race, when they sail in this area, they have no reference points. They can easily add 2 time zones and nobody will be able to tell.